Good afternoon, all. Welcome to the fiscal year 23 Partner Awardee Orientation. My name is Keisha Harvey, and I am a team member on the Projects Branch. I will be your moderator for today and will present along with Russell Ames, our Projects Branch Chief. We have many of our colleagues in the background helping to move slides along today for you all. Before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to go over a few announcements. The training slides and recording will be available as soon as possible and made available to you on the RCPP website. It takes about a month to make the recordings available. Presenters will not be on the cameras today to conserve bandwidth. We will turn on our cameras briefly to introduce ourselves if bandwidth allows. For some attendees, there may be a slight lag before you see slides being presented. For others, you may not experience any lag time. This presentation should be recording for all attendees on the list. And today, if you have any questions, we're running a little behind due to technical difficulties. You can send those questions into the inbox or contact your RCPP coordinator for your state. We'll provide answers to as many questions as possible once you send those questions into day. So with that said, we're going to take a quick pause and then Russell Ames will start presenting.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the delay. It's always challenging sometimes to get the technology to work. So I'll take over these slides. Again, we will have this recording posted and we'll notify all folks on the invitee list when it is available, given the delay and that some folks' schedules may no longer accommodate the full time. In creating the new event, we accidentally failed to add a Q&A. So please submit your questions to the RCPP inbox. That is rcpp@usda.gov. We'll add that to a slide at the end when we get to our Q&A. And we've got several folks on the Projects Branch team that will be monitoring that inbox so we can answer your questions at the end. Again, thanks for your patience as we work through some technical difficulties. So today we're going to go over just an overview of the awards that were made under the fiscal year 2023 funding opportunity, going over some overview information of the how RCPP works, and then we're going to dive into the important part of what you'll be working on with your state coordinators to negotiate your programmatic partnership agreement, as well as outlining some of the steps of what will happen after that. So this year we selected 81 projects totaling just over $1 billion. You may notice that's a little bit more than we included in the funding opportunity, but we had a incredible amount of proposals with an ask of $2.2 billion. So we were able to dip into fiscal year 2024 funds to make sure we could select all of the really excellent projects that rose to the top of the ranking and scoring criteria. So as we've done for the last few years, we ran a concurrent competition for both classic and alternative funding arrangements. So we made 51 awards that were classic projects and 30 alternative funding arrangements. One thing you did not have to select when you proposed was what funding source you wanted for your project, but we did allocate either Farm Bill funds or Inflation Reduction Act funds, depending on the project goals and objectives. So 21 of those projects are Farm Bill funded projects, and the other 60 are funded through the Inflation Reduction Act. As a reminder, RCPP awards are tentative and subject to negotiation. So what that really means is you cannot begin any work that will be reimbursed using RCPP funds until you have an obligation made, which will not be the programmatic partnership agreement, but that will be a key step along the way. In your award notifications, we noted a deadline for executing the agreement. So that's not the deadline for submitting the agreement. That is the deadline for completing and both parties signing the agreement, and that's May 18th, 2024. In the coming weeks, the state RCP coordinators that are leading the negotiation will let you know their internal deadlines for getting the agreement drafted and into the review process so that you can make that execution deadline of May 18th, 2024. So just as a reminder, I'm sure you're aware of the specific features of classic and alternative funding arrangements based on which project type you selected when creating your proposal. But just as a reminder, with RCPP Classic, the key difference is delivery of financial assistance, which in most cases is delivered by NRCS through producer contracts. And NRCS will be very involved in the technical assistance delivery of that project. So your proposal might not have included any NRCS TA, but that's something you'll need to work with your state coordinator, and is definitely likely to change as the state coordinators take that proposal and turn it into an agreement. With the alternative funding arrangements, however, we typically expect the partner to deliver all technical assistance, so your proposal likely won't change much in that regard, but some details of what specific activities are covered will be negotiated by your state coordinator. So again, alternative funding arrangements are not a grant, and we'll get to that much later in the process when you're negotiating your supplemental agreements, which will have deliverables for which you will be reimbursed after the work or deliverable has been completed, or at least partially completed, depending on how the payment valuation methods are written. But just as a reminder to make sure we're on the same page there. So you may be wondering how the funding source will impact your project, and in many ways it won't. So the key differences are Farm Bill funds do not expire. However, Inflation Reduction Act funds do expire in fiscal year 2031. And the Inflation Reduction Act gives us specific direction of how to prioritize the use of those funds. But again, that won't impact your project. That was part of our selection criteria. And since projects will begin in fiscal year 2024, the fact that the funds expire in 2031 is not going to be an issue. These are going to be the same processes, agreements, and structures for implementing these projects, and the same reporting requirements, regardless of what funding source was assigned to your RCPP project. So looking at the funding overview. So this specific split is based on how the proposals are structured. So when you were creating your proposal, you were limited to 7% of the project in TA that is for project-wide technical assistance. So your outreach, your outcomes assessment, your project management. And then the portal automatically added 18% of additional technical assistance to support the delivery of financial assistance. So those were restrictions in your proposal. You'll have more flexibility as you negotiate with your state coordinators. Your states have the authority to allow different allocations of technical assistance. Part of that will go to NRCS if it's a classic project, but the breakdown of TA for support of FA and for support of the project at wide can change from that 7 and 18% split. And you have the option of seeking additional FA in lieu of TA. These are all things your state coordinator will lead you through the process for, and our flexibilities the state have, depending on the availability of remaining FA in our national reserves. But the key thing is that you will be limited to a maximum amount of 25% of TA for your project, but there's a lot more flexibility that you and your state coordinators will have to find the right mix to make your project successful. But ultimately, NRCS is responsible for making sure there is enough technical assistance to support all of your conservation activities that will be funded through financial assistance. So they're going to work with you to try to accommodate your project needs as much as possible, but we'll make sure that the TA is there to support our FA activities. So RCPP projects, I like to say, are kind of a union of like-minded projects, and so there are various components of that. there is a single programmatic partnership agreement. This is very similar to an MOU, and that is going to be one agreement between NRCS and the lead partner. That will help us know where we make allocations for our financial assistance and technical assistance to NRCS state offices. And then under that, depending on whether it's a classic or alternative funding arrangement, we then begin working on the specific mechanisms to deliver that financial assistance and technical assistance. So in classic, that might be NRCS producer contracts. And in some cases for classic, there might be a supplemental agreement to deliver part of the financial assistance in support of producer contracts. And then for technical assistance in classic, that will likely be both NRCS TA and partner delivered TA through that supplemental agreement. Or if it was an alternative funding arrangement, all of the TA will likely go through the partner through a supplemental agreement. So the programmatic partnership agreement is very much like an MOU that will define how money will be spent, where and when. So that's not getting down into the weeds on specific projects we'll fund, on specific practices even. This is looking at the 20,000 foot level, how we're going to allocate funds for this project. And we'll get into that in more specifics when we start going over the sections of the programmatic partnership agreement. It also is where we define our expected partner contributions, outcomes, and how the lead partner will be responsible for reporting those. Now, in terms of how financial assistance is delivered, the PPA also helps with that. It's an opportunity for the partner to provide input on how FA will be delivered in classic, and in alternative funding arrangements, it documents how the partner will deliver that FA. Again, this PPA, the programmatic partnership agreement, does not obligate funding, but we're going to work to get these quickly implemented to get the funds in place so that we can begin the second step, which is all of those child agreements or NRCS helping with implementation of this project. So I'm not going to go into the weeds on supplemental agreements other than they are how we will obligate financial assistance and or technical assistance to eligible partners. So this includes the lead partner or other partners that the lead partner wishes to be directly involved. It provides flexibility to obligate funding as the needs arise. But once that PPA is executed, those funds are allocated to NRCS state offices and locked in place for the purposes in that PPA. So you don't have to worry about those funds getting reallocated or repurposed elsewhere. They are reserved for that project, but they're not obligated until they can get pulled into a supplemental agreement. So the state coordinator is going to be your primary POC for the entire agreement negotiation and execution process. The projects branch at the national level will be supporting our state RCPP coordinators, and we've also instituted some changes in fiscal year 2023 that you'll see in how these agreements are negotiated. We're working on ways to get you reimbursed faster. We are finding ways to help decrease the complexity of deliverables, both in the programmatic partnership agreement and the supplemental agreement. And that will then lead to streamlined reporting requirements. So NRCS does have two requirements towards the lead partner in terms of reporting. Every 6 months, NRCS is responsible for providing a report on the status of pending and obligated producer contracts. And then through the annual report that will be jointly delivered by NRCS and the lead partner, that's how we'll provide information on how NRCS is using technical assistance within the project to support the project. So what are the components of the programmatic partnership agreement? So there is the template that will be, for the most part, identical for all agreements with just some project-specific information that will be plugged in automatically by the portal. This is a non-negotiable part of the agreement because a specific template that was approved for use in our program that we do not have the authority to change lightly. Now, the PPA also has attachments and exhibits, and that forms the basis of what your state coordinator will be creating in the portal to create this complete agreement package. And those are the parts that it will be negotiating. There are some things that are non-negotiables. That's project type. You can't change your project type from classic to alternative funding arrangement or back. You cannot change your funding source. That is a decision that has been made by NRCS. You cannot change your geographic area or your resource concerns or conservation benefits. There is one exception there. If we find there was an error in how the agreement or project record was created, and we can find a justification within the proposal language that shows the error was made, we can make those corrections, but we can't just make changes because that was part of the selection criteria of your award. Another thing that is non-negotiable is there is an option to include pre-selected contracts, parcels, and projects in your proposal that then can be funded without our full ranking process. They still need to be determined eligible contracts, parcels, projects, but you cannot negotiate substitutions or new pre-selected contracts, parcels, or projects as part of your agreement. We can only include what you included in your proposal. So there are additional considerations for alternative funding arrangement projects, and your state coordinators have been trained on this entire process, the agreements, and this, so they'll be able to help you out. But you're going to have to work with your state coordinator to see what process and documentation you're going to create and deliver to the state to help with HEO, highly erodible land and wetlands compliance, with payment eligibility and AGI compliance, adjusted gross income check compliance. If you're using alternative ways of implementing conservation activities that don't fall under our existing practice standards that have categorical exclusions, there may be initial NEPA requirements, and your state coordinator will work on you with what are those requirements, what documentation do they need from you so that NRCS can sign off on these changes. And just some additional contractual natures of the RCPP agreements to consider. Once we get into the supplemental agreements for both Classic and AFA, you're going to have to work out payment methods for how you will be reimbursed for the activities you complete. And one of the regular sticking points for AFAs is whenever there's pay for performance, and it's not to say that is a challenge in itself, but just think through what model you want to use, whether you're looking at actual costs, costless, pay for performance, and work that out with your state coordinator. Again, the PPA does not obligate funding, neither for classic or alternative funding arrangements, and supplemental agreements may need to include technical standards to be met depending on the deliverables included in that agreement. So here are the different tabs that you and your state coordinator will see in the portal for how we generate the programmatic partnership agreement. All of the sections highlighted in green are largely pre-populated from the proposal. That doesn't mean they will be complete or not need to change, but there will be at least some data starting off those tabs. The other tabs, outcomes, exhibits, and the confidentiality agreement, you're going to be starting from scratch. But again, your state coordinator has been trained on how to complete these sections and will be your guide through the process. So I know I've said this a few times, but I just really want to highlight it so we're all on the same page. The programmatic partnership agreement is very much like, sorry, it's not an MOU, it is very much like an MOU. So keep your financial assistance and technical assistance deliverables simple. So your deliverables will be organized into 3 categories: financial assistance, technical assistance, and partner contributions. And again, all 3 of those tabs are pre-populated based on what you included in your proposal. This is something I think many partners don't realize. Our annual reports are based on your deliverables tabs. So the number of rows in your PPA deliverables tables is the number of rows you'll be reporting on in your annual report. So your state coordinator is going to help guide you through of what the right level of detail is so you don't make your agreement unnecessarily complicated. We want to know what is being done, but we want to give you the flexibility to adapt to the changing needs, because remember, these are 5-year projects and you want to put as much detail as you can of what you know won't change and give yourself flexibility to adapt as the project is implemented. So again, I'm not going to prescribe exactly the right level of detail, but this is what the FA deliverable table will look like. And here they get down into the weeds for specific years, for specific projects, that may or may not materialize that will lead to many agreement amendments. And that's one thing we want to avoid. We want to find the right balance. That's not to say that you should be afraid of amendments. They're easy, they are possible as your needs evolve over the life of the project. But we can avoid many amendments by giving ourselves the right level of detail in the PPA and saving some conversations for after the PPA for how FA will be delivered by NRCS and Classic, or how partner will deliver FA and TA through supplemental agreements. So in technical assistance, we've still somewhat have two categories that we're working to better consolidate in future years. But there's technical assistance that supports specific FA activities. So this is your planning, your practice survey, layout, design, installation, certification. And for Classic, this is going to be jointly an NRCS responsibility and partner responsibility if the partner has the capacity and capability to perform the work according to NRCS specifications, standards, and the NRCS planning process. So depending on the capabilities of your organization and your other partners, some Classic projects will delegate a lot of this type of technical assistance to partners. And it's okay if you don't have that capability. That's maybe why you chose a Classic project, and NRCS will help you out with that. For alternative funding arrangements, that type of technical assistance really should be a partner's responsibility. Again, we also have technical assistance that supports the project at large. This is outreach, outcomes assessment, and project management. And this will be another great example of where your state coordinator will help guide you through. We've got, I think, 7 or 8 different drop-down options under technical assistance to support the project, or otherwise known as enhancement technical assistance. But you really don't need to break that out in great detail in your programmatic partnership agreement, and your state coordinators will help you with that. So if you want to create a single deliverable for project management and in the notes section say, hey, we think, a third of this will be outreach, a third will be outcomes, and a third will be project management. That's setting a certain amount of money for that purpose for supplemental agreements, and then you and the state will work out the specific deliverables that you can be reimbursed for in the supplemental agreement. So there are some things that NRCS cannot delegate to the partner, such as verifying producer eligibility for USDA payment, verifying highly erodible lands and wetlands conservation compliance, or verifying the eligibility for a full payment based on a producer's adjusted gross income. NRCS also has certain non-delegable responsibilities to sign off on NEPA and HPA and ESA compliance. So for Classic and AFAs, states have dedicated funding outside the project for some of this. If they have additional work that the partner cannot perform, they might need additional technical assistance. But we've provided states direct allocations to make the projects a little simpler by covering some of these activities outside of the project. But that doesn't mean NRCS won't be involved just because you don't see it in the PPA. So in terms of contribution deliverables, here's another great example of where you might want to clean up your deliverables table compared to what was in your proposal. I often see a lot more detail here than you want. And remember, the more complicated your contribution deliverables table is, the more complicated your annual reporting will be. So what is actually required? 1 deliverable per partner per activity type. We've also streamlined the process for how we look at the valuation methodology for your contributions. We no longer have an attachment per deliverable. Instead, we've added some additional sections to our contribution letter that will help show how we are verifying the amount and type of activities included in your contributions. So that means if your contributions change, you may need to update your contribution letter, which is not something we've done in the past, but you no longer have these deliverable specific valuation methodologies that you need to upload or change. Every project this year was fully funded, so that should make it a lot easier. There won't be quite as many changes to contributions as we have in past years. But in case you do need to make changes, wanted you to be aware of what is required and what's not. So contributions delivered as of the award announcement, so November 1st, are eligible. But again, you should work with your state coordinator to make sure that those contributions will be deemed eligible, and you can't report on them until they're in the programmatic partnership agreement. So another component we talked about is outcomes. That's something that's very important to Congress. If you've read our Farm Bill language, and it's also very important to us. Your proposal included outcomes of how you will report on the environmental and maybe also the social and economic benefits. So in prior farm bills, we've looked at kind of counting the beans of how many parcels did we enroll? How many practices did we implement? So those are great activities that we do, but what is the actual impact of those contracts and those practices, and what is the benefit to how the resource concerns are addressed? So statute requires partners to report on environmental outcomes for every project. Economic and social outcomes are optional, but if they were included in the proposal, they are a required part of your programmatic partnership agreement. So at the bare minimum, we need at least a solid environmental outcome for the primary resource concern, but we also need outcomes that align with what you included in your proposal, because that is a strong part of the basis of how your project was selected. The outcomes will define both the NRCS and lead partner responsibilities, and it will include small narrative sections for how you can outline how you will create a baseline of the data, how you're going to calculate the change, and a general note section for any accomplishments you want to include. So outcomes should be reported on for both NRCS and partner-funded activities. So now we get on to the final section of the PPA, exhibits, and I'm going to hand it over to Keisha Harvey, who's going to finish the presentation.
Thanks, Russell. And hello again, everyone. So my next few slides will cover exhibits, AGI waivers, reporting requirements, and next steps. So in the PPA, we also have exhibits, and the purpose of those exhibits is to help inform NRCS administration of RCPP funded FA and TA. We'll talk a little bit more about, what those exhibits entail, reporting requirements, and next steps. And so again, if you have any questions, send it to the inbox, and we'll be able to try to answer some of those questions for you, or contact your RCPP coordinator. And we should be up momentarily. Thanks, Yamika. So just to recap, we'll cover exhibits, AGI waivers, reporting requirements, and next steps. So in the PPA, we have exhibits. The purpose is to inform NRCS of RCPP funded FA and TA activities within the project. So we have the following exhibits for PPAs: land management, rental, U.S. held easement activity, entity held easement, and watershed activity, and also technical assistance activity. And so in Classic, we just want to make sure everyone understands this for Classic. Don't stress about the exhibits. Literally, some items in exhibit can be to be determined and revisited or adjusted during the terms of the PPA, where NRCS determines changes are consistent with program requirements. However, to emphasize, it is important to note that for AFAs, the exhibits need to be completed during the PPA negotiations. For AFAs, the exhibits identify how partner-led activities will be administered and implemented to support the project and meet program requirements. And so just to sum it up, these exhibits are really here to help everyone get on the same page with how the project's going to be implemented. Next slide. Okay, so here's an example of a land management exhibit for land management and in the PPA, and how it's and why this exhibit's important. And your RCPP coordinator will guide you through these documents. So again, the exhibits document negotiated project level expectations. They help understand how the project's going to happen, for example, over the next 5 years. And of course, for Classic, and as I mentioned earlier, you can adjust those exhibits. So the exhibits provide details on what are the resource concerns the project is addressing, for example. And so here's some examples. Are there historically, it's going to provide information for discussion for you and your coordinators. Are there historically underserved producers that are going to be in a priority area in this project, and how to prioritize them? So this is just some of the information that's in the exhibits. What are the land uses that the partner would like to target, and what are those conservation practices? And how much are we going to pay the producer for participating? Is the lead partner interested in pursuing an adjusted gross income waiver? So that's just some of the examples of what's in the PPA exhibits for land management. Next slide. So here's a PPA exhibit example for entity held easements. Same thing I mentioned before, but a few extra, things in there related to easements. Are there priority parcels? Are you trying to use buy, protect, sell approach? Again, this is just to get everyone on the same page with how the project's going to be implemented. Next slide. In the PPA exhibits, you can note whether you would like a project-wide waiver. But before I get in more detail on that, there's ability to waive AGI requirements. It's possible through the negotiation process where you can request an applicability waiver. That's a project-wide waiver. And so for AGI, there's two types of waivers. The first type is that you as a lead partner can actually request during the negotiations to waive the applicability of AGI, which is adjusted gross income, entirely for a project. Let's say you have a land management project for all the land management activities or all the entity held easements. In this case, producers, if you get an approved applicability waiver for AGI, they do not have to meet AGI. And they do not even have to get an AGI determination, but it has to be requested during the PPA negotiation. And there has to be a good reason for it. The lead partner can't just say, hey, we think this will be a lot easier for us if our producers don't have a AGI determination. A good reason, for example, might be we're working on a wildlife corridor project, and these 5 parcels are really critical to a certain species migration. Unfortunately, 3 of the 5 landowners are over the AGI limit but have critical conservation parcels. So in essence, there needs to be a justification for that project-wide waiver for approval. What's not a good justification? Paperwork is burdensome. It would be good for the producer not to complete the AGI form. On the other hand, if a project doesn't get or doesn't request an AGI applicability, which is a project-wide waiver, individual producers may request to waive the AGI limit for a specific contract. We call these AGI limitation waivers. This only applies to a specific contract and producer. The justification must document how the waiver will protect environmentally sensitive land of special significance. So work with your coordinator to better understand the difference between those two types of AGI waivers. Next slide. So reporting requirements. Here's a little information about reporting requirements for your projects. We require a single annual progress report where you'll be asked to report on progress on deliverables and outcomes. And then NRCS generally includes information about project outputs like contracts and acres. There's a final report and a fact sheet required at the end of the project as well, where we will ask folks to report on outcomes as best as they can at the end of the project. Next slide. So what are the next steps? Complete and sign a PPA by May 18th, 2024. After the PPA has been completed and signed, work with your coordinator to negotiate and sign a supplemental agreement as needed. Those supplemental agreements actually obligate the technical assistance funds. Work with NRCS to plan sign-ups to enroll producers and landowners for Classic. Make sure to submit annual calendar year progress reports in March of each year. Next slide. And so going with next steps for FA delivery and Classic and alternative funding arrangements, AFAs. So for Classic, implement work included in the active supplemental agreement. So once the PPA is approved, work to get a supplemental agreement completed. Work with NRCS to provide input as allowed in the PPA on NRCS signups. Provide outreach to help NRCS enroll additional producers/landowners. And for AFAs, implement work included in the active SA. So work after the PPA has been completed and signed, work to get an active SA and submit payment requests on a recurring basis. So those are some tidbits for next steps for FA delivery. And next slide. All right, so let the negotiations begin. But maybe you've already done so with your coordinator, which is great. If not, get with your coordinator soon so you all can start negotiating your PPA. And if you have any questions on the next slide, you can submit questions to the RCPP inbox or contact your RCPP coordinator with any questions that you have. And I will turn it back over to Russell for final comments.
Thank you, Keisha. So now with the remaining time, we'll accept questions. Those need to be submitted through RCPP at USDA.gov, but we're working on collating all of those, and we'll cover as many as we can during the remainder of this webinar's time, and any that we aren't able to get to, we'll follow up afterwards. I ask that if you get into very project-specific situations, please save those questions for your state coordinator. But if you have general policy process questions, this is a great opportunity for you to ask those questions. So I'll start with the list. So the first question I see is a question on IRA funded projects, asking if in projects that were funded through the Inflation Reduction Act, do all components of that project, including perhaps every easement or every land management contract, need to include a climate smart practice? So that's a great question. RCPP's statutory authority for the use of Inflation Reduction Act is a little bit different than the other programs. Other programs are limited to that specific climate smart agriculture and forestry practice list. RCPP is not. So projects were selected because a component of the project aligned well with the goals and intentions of the Inflation Reduction Act funding. So that might be reducing greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sequestration, through a variety of methods. So there will be parts of IRA funded projects that may not be a perfect fit. So there's not a requirement that you have at least one of those practices on every producer contract in an IRA funded classic contract. So complex, but good question. The next question is, for alternative funding arrangements, can NRCSTA be less than 5%? So there is not a minimum amount of NRCSTA required for alternative funding arrangements, and it will again depend on the capacity of the partner, the lead partner, or whatever other eligible partners will be delivering technical assistance to manage that work. You may need some help for NRCSTA, and so you can include NRCSTA if there are certain aspects of the project that you need NRCS support for, but there's not a minimum, so you do not have to require 5% for NRCS as we have required in previous years. The last question for me before I hand it over to Seth is NRCS able to share lead partner information for each of the fiscal year 2023 RCPP projects so we can communicate with each other? So we don't share contact information for partners, but we do provide a list of all of the awarded projects for RCPP since the start of Farm Bill 2018, and we even have a list of older projects. And that does include the lead partner, so you're welcome to reach out, but we're not going to provide contact information to awardees at this time. And I believe Seth is taking the next question.
Sure, I can do that. So with respect to AGI waivers, someone asked, when do landowners have to submit the AGI forms and for what income period? Is it when a supplemental agreement is signed? Is it also at closing? To cover what years and when does it matter, really? And I think there's a more fundamental question here that you may want to consider, since we're currently talking about newly selected projects and you are about to enter your PPA negotiations. You're going to want to sit down with your lead state and figure out which type of AGI waiver is most applicable to your project. There's both the project applicability waiver, which means that nobody participating in a particular financial activity like an entity held easement would ever need an AGI waiver in that project. There's also the individual applications for a particular parcel contract where a landowner has already been determined eligible and an applicability waiver is not present on the whole project. Since you're at the PPA phase, it may behoove you to get that applicability waiver and basically sidestep the entire timing question that you're getting at. But if you're in an active project or you don't think you want a blanket AGI waiver, then you're basically filing for the prior year, and the field offices where you're working will be able to give you the forms. Prior couple of years, actually, I believe, for the current year. So basically, they're gonna fill out the form and look at the tax stuff in any given year. Now we're in 24, so they're gonna fill out the 24 version of the form. It's gonna look at their prior year taxes, and that's how we'll establish individual eligibility. But again, I would typically suggest sidestepping individual eligibility unless there's a reason at the project level that you don't want an applicability waiver. Next question here that has my name next to it basically asks, for the in-kind match that was included in our proposal, are we allowed to start counting match dollars for the project now that the awards have been made while we wait to finalize the agreements with NRCS? And then they go on and say, if we are one of the conditionally approved projects, will we be treated differently on when in-kind match can start to be counted? The statutory requirement here is that we are allowed to count contributions, and I'm switching words here, right? I'm switching from match to contribution. We're allowed to count contributions that are delivered after the date of the announcement of project selection and prior to the end of a particular partnership agreement. So in this case, where we're in the window before the PPA has been executed, but after the date that the project has been selected, you can potentially work on those items that you want to count as contribution. You'll ultimately end up reporting them only to the extent that they get included in the PPA. So if, for instance, they are determined to be ineligible or determined to have an inflated valuation method that needs to be adjusted, then we might not count them exactly as you propose them. But we will certainly make every effort to get them included and get them included at the value that you asserted in your proposal and your original contribution letters. We just can't provide you that certainty until we actually look at the contribution letters and negotiate the PPA. And then with respect to your tentatively selected projects, that's not a question we've dealt with yet. I think there's an issue with respect to the legal requirement, i.e. the date of the chief's announcement of project selection. You're only going to be tentatively approved for contributions if you ultimately make it in under the current NFO. If you have to slip forward into a future NFO and recompete, then you would be sort of in a holding period again. But if that is a major concern for your particular project, please give us a holler and we can look deeper into that tentative selection issue. Then the next question here, that maybe I'll skip to Russell so you can hear somebody else's voice, and then we'll come back to me. Russell, are you ready for the next question?
I'm ready for the next question. Thank you, Seth. So a partner asked, will partners be required to submit an annual report in fiscal year 2024? So two responses to that. One, our reporting requirements are based on calendar years. So all of the projects awarded under the 2023 NFO will begin implementation when your PPAs are executed in calendar year 2024. So very likely, and hopefully, some activities will happen in calendar year 2024, and you'll report on whatever partial year the project is. So that will be your first partial year of implementation. If for some reason your agreement doesn't have much progress, you'll still be required to submit a report, but it shouldn't take long to fill out that what wasn't accomplished in calendar year 2024. The next question is about partner payments. So for an AFA project, what is the frequency allowed for reimbursement requests? So that is something that you will work with the NRCS state office managing your agreement and provide input to them on what frequency you think they have the bandwidth for, and that will help your organization manage your cash flow as you're working on the deliverables within your supplemental agreements.
Thank you, Russell. I will take back the mic for a second and answer the next question, which has to do with entity-held easements. The question was, we have a landowner with eligible property for our RCPP project who is interested in an entity-held easement. The landowner has an existing mortgage/land loan with the Farm Services Agency, or FSA. We understand that the easement will require the lender to subordinate to the easement holder, and we are concerned that FSA will not agree to do this. We have had problems with other lenders subordinating in the past. Do you know if FSA can subordinate the mortgage, and if not, who can we contact to explore this? And unfortunately, I cannot provide you a definitive hard answer because it really is a question of FSA authorities and the implementation of those at a local level. I would suggest you start in either the field office of the county that you are hoping that this landowner is going to enroll in, or with the FSA state office in that same state, because ultimately FSA is going to have to make a determination, hey, do we have authority to allow this subordination, given the fact that this easement is going to inherently reduce the resale value of the land. And that's a pretty, that's inherently what an easement does. So many lenders will not subordinate, and I do not know if FSA has authority or interest in doing so. There are a couple more questions with my name next to them. I'll take this next one. It's also an entity-held easement question, and it asks about TAI funding for entity-held easements. It says, is funding available for TAI for entity-held easements? And the general answer is probably not. The real limitation here is that our authority for entity-held easements is directly related to the ALE authority for entity-held easements, and our agreements are modeled around the ALE agreements. The ALE pattern that is carried forward into RCPP stipulates that the entity holding the easement is doing XYZ PD at Q to earn the FA that helps them close the easement, i.e. that entity is responsible for having a viable landowner application, working with that landowner to make sure they're eligible, providing us that application and addressing our related planning questions, etc. So basically that FA contract that we are ultimately going to use to support the entity-held easement acquisition already requires the entity to do all the things that you might be looking for entity-held TA for, and we don't have authority to pay them. So generally speaking, no TAI for entity-held easements. You want to tag team, Russell, and do the next one, or do you want me to keep going?
I can cover the next few. So the next question is about entity-held easements and asks for a project that was funded with Inflation Reduction Act, a classic project. Is it required that the project be with a historically underserved landowner, or can the conservation easement be between an entity and a landowner who doesn't fall into the historically underserved category? So there is not a requirement for easements under any funding source or project type to be with a historically underserved landowner or producer. However, the maximum amount of the value of the easement that will be paid out will be impacted by whether or not the landowner is a historically underserved producer or landowner. But it's not a requirement to have a conservation easement under an IRA funded project. The next question is about advance payments. So the NFO noted that advance payments may be available for AFA supplemental agreements. Is that something you're working on, and can you discuss progress? Unfortunately, we don't have any concrete details for that. If you read our statutory language, it talks specifically about advanced authority for certain types of technical assistance. And we don't have a defined process for making that work just yet, but we're continuing to explore options. So move on to the next question. Is if a project partner is another federal agency, such as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, will that affect how USDA NRCS pursues compliance for the Endangered Species Act or NEPA? Will it change the lead agency for that compliance role? So I'll address that before I get to the second part of that question of, because this is NRCS funding, this will be NRCS's responsibility for reviewing compliance with all of those federal regulations, regardless of what other federal agencies may be involved to provide contributions. But anything that uses NRCS funding will remain an NRCS responsibility. The second part of the question is, if a partner is an Indian tribal organization participating through NHPA, will that affect how USDA NRCS pursues compliance? Will it change the lead agency for that compliance role? I may need to get back to you on that because I'm not sure I'm understanding all of the nuances of it, but I don't believe that should impact, because again, if it's NRCS funding, NRCS will be the responsible federal agency. But I'll look into that.
I might just add a little bit to that. NRCS doesn't necessarily have to be the lead agency for a NEPA document on a project that entails both RCPP funding and another federal agency's funding. So for instance, in both of these situations, it is possible that we would become a participating agency on another agency's EIS or EA or something. But if you have real particular questions about that process, you probably should get to us with the situational details and we can help you work through them. But everything Russell said is ultimately, yes, NRCS does have to accept that that NEPA analysis is correct because it is our dollars. The particulars of how we do that in the NEPA document can vary. I'd like to pick up the next question, which seems to have my name next to it. It says, and this one's about third-party contributions or contractors in an AFA project. The question reads, for AFAs, if we are directing TA funds to a contractor, not a producer, to install practices for a producer, does the contractor have to comply with AGI limits or other eligibility? And the answer there is no. The supplemental agreement structure sort of falls under the PPA structure and basically renders partners not subject to the AGI requirement. We still have to have eligible beneficiaries. So your individual landowner who's going to be the beneficiary of these installed practices does have to be AGI and HELWC eligible, but the contractor that does the work on their land and gets paid by a partner via a supplemental agreement or the AFA contract, depending on where we go with that, does not necessarily have to be to file AGI or be AGI eligible.
Thank you, Seth. I can take back over for the next few questions. So the next two questions are both about adjusted gross income waivers. One question from a partner is they experienced challenges processing an AGI limitation waiver. So again, those are producer contract specific waivers that have a higher threshold for approval because they must protect land of environmental special significance. So those do have a longer processing time because we're looking at the technical adequacy of those requests. But there is an additional AGI waiver type in RCPP in that while you're negotiating your programmatic partnership agreement, you can ask for an applicability waiver where if the waiver will benefit the goals and purposes of the project, you can waive the requirement to receive AGI determinations or limit payments for the entire project. So if you've had challenges in the past with AGI limitation waivers, please, when you're negotiating your PPA, consider whether or not you have a justification for an applicability waiver to waive it once. In terms of processing time, those happen as part of your PPA negotiation, and usually don't add any additional time to the PPA negotiation because there are many other parts going on in parallel. So work with your state coordinator to see if that's a good fit for your project. The next question related to AGI waivers is, if the landowner signs the AGI forms when the supplemental agreement happens in 2022 and it closes in 2024, do they have to sign the forms again and be eligible in 2024? So determinations happen based on when they submit their forms and they receive an eligibility determination. There are abilities once they receive a determination for that status to roll forward in their FSA records. So when I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this because it'll vary very much on the circumstances of the producer contract and if this is a classic AFA. But we can work with you on that. But when those producer contracts are enrolled, we'll be looking at their status within FSA, and if they've completed that paperwork and it's able to be rolled over, they may not be required to resubmit for that future year. But if there are changes, the producer is responsible for reporting that. But work with your state coordinator if you've got specific questions on how AGI determinations are needed at the producer contract level and how that will impact their RCPP project. The last question I'm seeing is about recordings and the slides, and we are going to work on that. For recordings, it does take a while because we have to get captions manually generated before we're allowed to post on the web. We can post slides much earlier, so we'll work on getting those slides distributed to the attendees of this event and on the RCPP website. But that's the last question I'm seeing in our queue. So I'll just give it another minute to see if we have any more questions coming in. I'll just add thank you so much for your patience as we work through some technical difficulties. Glad we're able to eventually make it work for those of you that attended. And thank you for the great questions and comments. I've heard from state coordinators, many of you are already working on your agreement negotiations, so that's great. We look forward to seeing those proposals turn into great projects. And again, your state coordinator will be your primary contact for the remainder of your project and your agreement negotiation. And they know how to loop in folks from national headquarters when they need additional help. So with that, I think we'll call it a day and thank you all very much for attending.